I only signed up for one workshop,
Right, I think I've been given the signal to start, is that correct? Good. So, welcome everyone. I'm Rainer Schulze, the Director of the Human Rights Center, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you last end of the academic year and still coming to these events. This evening's lecture marks two separate and yet two very closely related events. On the one hand, this is the beginning of the formal cooperation and collaboration between the International Center on Human Rights and Drug Policy on the one hand, and the Human Rights Center at the University of Essex on the other. And we are also launching the first joint project, the Human Rights and Drug Policy Debate Series, which is led by the ICHRDP and is based in the School of Law. The International Center on Human Rights and Drug Policy was only set up in 2009, but in this short period, it has already developed an excellent reputation for its innovative and cutting-edge work in legal and human rights research and teaching on issues related to drug laws, policy, and enforcement. You will have seen the journal which the ICHRDP is publishing, the only peer-reviewed human rights journal specifically focusing on drug issues. And through its work, the ICHRDP, this doesn't come easily, you need to change that. Supports policy development which reconciles or aims to reconcile the International Narcotics Control Conventions with international human rights law. The Essex Human Rights Center is delighted to be associated with the ICHRDP. I believe we share the same philosophy of linking very closely high-quality research with both teaching and practice. And I can see quite a number of areas where we can develop new initiatives together and where partnership and cooperation will be to the benefit of both of us. This includes basically all areas of our work as far as I can see. I can see us developing joint multidisciplinary research projects which can potentially involve the wide range of academics across the whole of the university who engage in human rights work, not only law, but also sociology, health and human sciences, the Essex Business School, and more. I can also see us including units on human rights, drugs law, drug policy, drug enforcement in our human rights programs here at Essex as essential parts of our various spines in our MA and BA degrees. And I can see us developing CPDs and other training programs for practitioners that we can put on together both here and London and elsewhere. So I would argue the potential for both sides of an emerging partnership, and I hope that we will be able to sign a partnership very shortly, that the potential of such a partnership is immense. And I hope I'm not being too ambitious here, but given time, I think we can actually do something rather quite new and innovative together. The first example of our cooperation is the project that Noam will introduce very briefly in a moment. But before handing over to Noam, let me just say that I regard this project as only the first of many that will follow, the first step in the development of a fruitful and mutually beneficial relationship between the Essex Human Rights Center and the International Center for Human Rights and Drug Policy. So I hope this marks the beginning of a long relationship. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming, everyone, and I know what a busy time this is. I do think, hopefully, you'll find this, well, I'm sure you'll find it interesting. I think you'll find it actually relevant to a lot of the things that some of you are preparing for now in your various exams that you're getting ready for, and papers and so on. I just want to say on a personal note that it's actually quite special to see how quickly we got this off the ground, because this all started, this whole idea of a partnership and this project. I think we were 4 of us sitting in a lobby in a hotel in China about, how long was it? When was it, Nancy? Much less, I think. Less than a year, yeah. But yeah, not that long ago when we were thinking this is a great idea to form a partnership with Essex and we can start doing some projects, and we've managed to do that, so that's wonderful. We're actually launching a few things now. There's, as Rainer mentioned, there's the discussions of formal collaboration between the centres. There's also the project. There's also 2 publications, and one of them is the commentary on the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child with regard to protection from narcotic drugs. And Damon, I think, your talk's going to be all about that, isn't it? Or a lot about
partly,
that?
Yeah.
Right, okay, so we're going to hear about that, but this is a new publication that's just come out, and we're happy to be launching it here. There's the journal, and I'm supposed to take the pointer with me, right?
At the other side of it.
No, yes,
If you point to the right hand arrow, yeah.
that's done them both.
Oh.
Right, anyway, it's supposed to be the journal, because what you're holding now in your hands is the first issue. The second issue has just been launched as well, so this is the first time that, right now in virtual format, but that's being seen, the second issue of this journal. And then there's the project. Now, this project that we're doing, which is housed in the School of Law, is essentially the creation of a series of debates around the world looking at human rights and drug policy. And it'll happen in universities. We're still working on the various places, but discussions are about doing this in Colombia, Indonesia, China, possibly South Africa, as well as sort of the obvious candidates. I think we're talking about doing one at Yale, or I think, but around the world. And the topics that can be discussed, and you'll see this soon, that we're going to debate in these events range, and most people don't realize the wide range here when we talk about human rights and drug policy, but we're talking about mandatory death penalty for drug crimes. We're talking about ill treatment and abuse of drug users in detention. We're talking about wars, armed conflicts. I mean, think Afghanistan, Colombia, the link to violence in Mexico, indigenous rights, Bolivia and coca growers, and obviously a host of issues related to right to health, access to palliative care and certain medicines and so on. So it's endless, really, and it spans almost everything that you'll have looked at in your studies so far this year. There is something there that links to issues of drug policy. And hopefully some of that will be coming out in the lectures you'll see today. But this really is a cutting-edge area of human rights, one in which there are not that many and clearly not enough people working on. And so if you're also still thinking of sort of more areas for various papers and dissertations, there's plenty, and have a chat with Rick or Damon afterwards. They can give you lots of ideas. All right, this is an exciting area, cutting-edge area, and we're going to hear a lot about that from our 2 speakers. So I'll hand over now to Paul, who's going to be chairing. And thanks again for being here.
Good evening, everybody. When I served as rapporteur on the right to the highest attainable standard of health, Rick and Damon, our 2 speakers tonight, were extremely supportive and discreetly educated me about some issues that I was unfamiliar with. I say discreetly because I really didn't know much, but they didn't make me feel embarrassed about my ignorance, but educated me, and I'm most grateful to them. And I'm really delighted that we have this new institutional collaboration. And can I very briefly but warmly thank everybody who is responsible for making this collaboration happen. I'm delighted to welcome Rick and Damon and introduce them this evening. Each will speak for about 20 minutes. I suggest we have both presentations and then take Q&A. So briefly, first of all, a word of introduction about Rick. Rick is co-founder of the International Centre on Human Rights and Drug Policy. He's presently, poor man, Executive Director of Harm Reduction International. I say poor man because it's a tough job. It's a demanding job. And he's been working on HIV/AIDS, human rights and drug policy research and advocacy since before the flood, a long time ago, since the early 1990s. And he's very well known for his leading work in areas including HIV in prisons and the death penalty for drug offences. Rick has worked at a senior level for NGOs in Canada, Ireland, the UK, and is a member of the technical advisory group to the Global Commission on HIV and the Law, and also a member of the reference group to the United Nations on HIV and injecting drug use. And the title of Rick's presentation is Deliver Us from Evil, Drug Control, Human Rights and Parallel Universes. Many thanks, Rick.
Thank you. And thanks very much for all the warm welcome. Thank you to Rainer, and thank you to Noam and to Paul, all of whom have been very good friends of Damon and myself in the process of bringing the collaboration between our relatively new project and the Human Rights Center here at Essex. Also Paul, who's been a great friend of ours, as you said, well before Damon and I even founded this project, working together while Paul was the special rapporteur on issues related particularly to HIV and injecting drug use. And thanks to Noam for initially introducing this discussion of the possibility of partnership. And thanks to Nancy Prudhomme, our projects director, for helping to organize today. And especially thanks to all of you for joining us. Paul gave you the topic of my presentation. I'm going to be talking a bit more generally. I'm assuming that most people here are perhaps unfamiliar, would be an understatement, with the nature of international drug control law. So I'm going to try to give a bit of a historical overview and a contextual overview, and then I think Damon is going to take a particular area of drug control and dig down a bit deeper into some of the ways that human rights law engages issues of drug control. Now, see if I can make this work. Now, the man on the left is probably a familiar face. My left, your right, probably a familiar face to most of you. Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the United Nations. My guess is that the man standing next to him is probably less familiar to most of you. Does anyone know who that is? I wouldn't expect that you probably would, unless you were a drug control geek like us. His name is Hamid Godzi. He's the president of the International Narcotics Control Board, or the INCB. The International Narcotics Control Board is the treaty body, the United Nations treaty body, which is mandated to oversee the implementation of the 3 United Nations drug control conventions. So it's a parallel committee of independent experts, similar to the Human Rights Committee or the Committee on the Rights of the Child. But it sits specifically within the drug control regime. And just recently, this was in March, the INCB was the subject of a bit of controversy in relationship to this issue of human rights and drug control. One of the members of the board had been in Thailand releasing their annual report and was questioned by a reporter about whether the International Narcotics Control Board had a position on the death penalty for drugs. And the member of the board replied that the INCB had no position on the death penalty for drugs, which was quite unnerving because there actually is quite an established position of the United Nations as an entity, let alone the human rights regime within the United Nations, against the death penalty for drugs specifically, and of course the death penalty generally. Mr. Godzi was at a meeting of NGOs in March that Damon attended, There was a question raised about the death penalty. There was also a question raised about the board's annual report in regards to Vietnam. Vietnam is one of several countries in Asia and Southeast Asia that employs a process of mandatorily detaining people for drug use, arbitrary detention. About 50 to 100,000 people are detained specifically in Vietnam for periods of 2 or 3 years at a time. And a lot of the literature and the human rights monitoring of those camps have described them essentially as forced labor camps. The International Narcotics Control Board complimented Vietnam on their drug treatment regime and encouraged them to continue it. So there was a question from one of our NGO colleagues to Mr. Godzi at the NGO meeting, basically asking, in the context of these two issues, the death penalty and the arbitrary detention, is there actually no atrocity horrific enough that the International Narcotics Control Board would take a position on? To which Mr. Godzi replied, 100% no, because we don't actually see it as part of our mandate. We're not mandated to have an opinion. And of course, we're not really talking about matters of opinion here. We're talking about matters of international law. The International Narcotics Control Board is a forum within the regime of international law, yet they're not really looking at broader international law. And it's quite interesting to us, I think, because when he says they don't express their opinion, they are quite open about expressing other opinions. So while he doesn't want to have an opinion on established areas of human rights law, such as the prohibition of torture and inhuman and degrading treatment or punishment, or the international safeguards on the use of capital punishment, he is quite happy to make up his own human rights. He likes to talk about the right to be free from drug addiction, which is what he talked about in the most recent report of the International Narcotics Control Board. I mean, this is sort of a serious yet, a bit humorous, I suppose, example of where we have this disconnect between human rights and drug policy at the international level. Within the UN system, I suppose the biggest event every year where we see this disconnect is on the date of June 26th. When you look at the United Nations calendar of events every year, June 26th is the International Day Against Drug Abuse and Illicit Trafficking. It's also, ironically, the International Day in the support of victims of torture. So we have this day that's being sort of celebrated or commemorated at the UN for both drug control efforts and a key human rights norm. Of course, the irony here is that China is quite notorious for using June 26th as the day to publicly execute drug offenders. And they tend to execute dozens and dozens of people publicly. And for people who are students of the death penalty or interested in the death penalty, you'll know that China is actually quite secretive about its use of capital punishment. And June 26th is one of the only days of the year when they're not very secretive about it and are quite proud of executing people in their celebration of International Narcotics Control Day. And it's not just China. Indonesia executed some people a couple of years ago as well. So this is an example of what Professor Hunt said in a speech several years ago about this parallel universe, this concept of the United Nations drug control regime and the human rights regime operating as if they exist in parallel universes. We've seen that the drug control regime very rarely looks at issues related to human rights. And on the flip side, the human rights regime within the UN has, until recently, not really been very interested in drug control issues. And between these sort of two stools, or these two parallel universes, to use Professor Hunt's words, we see significant areas of human rights concern. But this isn't actually a new phenomenon within the UN. This kind of idea of parallel universes is as old as the institution itself. Just over 65, 66 years ago, here in London, was the very first meeting of the United Nations General Assembly. And one of the very first issues that the new UN General Assembly had on their list of items to talk about was what to do about this man. I'm good with pictures today. Anyone recognize him? That's General Francisco Franco, who was the fascist leader of Spain. Franco had led a coup about 10 years prior against the democratically elected government of Spain, with large support from Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, as well as a number of major US corporations, but that's sort of a different story for the time being, overthrew the democratically elected government and fought on the side of the Axis powers in World War II. After the end of World War II, Franco was really the only one of the major fascist leaders who remained in power. So as this new United Nations, this new international organization came together, one of the first things on the agenda was what to do about the organization's relationship to Spain, because governments didn't actually recognize Franco as a legitimate government. They recognized the Republican government that had been deposed. So the delegation of Panama proposed a resolution to the UN General Assembly, essentially that Franco's Spain be debarred from membership in the United Nations, and specifically banned from participating in any conferences or activities which may be arranged by the United Nations. And when you read the debates and the summary records of that meeting, wonderful speeches from pretty much all of the states represented about the need to not engage with Franco, how we don't recognize the government of Franco, we recognize the rights of the Republican government that had been deposed. This resolution was passed almost unanimously. There were just a couple of Latin American states who opposed it. I suppose probably states that would have been sympathetic to Franco at the time. That's fine. We can see that's very much in keeping with the founding of the United Nations. 6 months later, in Lake Success, New York, we had the third meeting of the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations. And one of the things on the agenda of that meeting was that they struck a subcommittee to deal with the issue of narcotic drugs. Before the UN was founded, we had the League of Nations. There was half a dozen international drug control treaties agreed under the League of Nations. And one of the first things on the agenda of the Economic and Social Council was how do we bring this body, this existing body of treaty law on drugs, under the umbrella of the United Nations. And so they were debating or drafting a protocol in order to do that. And again, Franco was on the agenda. In this case, there was a resolution put forward jointly by the governments of the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, and China, basically to say that in the context of drug control, we should not engage with Franco. We should respect the resolution that had been passed 6